Yesterday, the Chimera's crew had trusted and respected the Grand Admiral. After today, they would be ready to die for him. And for the first time in 5 years, Pellaeon finally knew in the deepest level of his being that the old Empire was gone. The new Empire, with Grand Admiral Thrawn at its head, had been born.
This week we had a massive drop of reveals for the next wave of Star Wars releases. Seriously massive. Among the anticipated series like Kenobi and Andor, and the continuation of The Mandalorian, we also saw several announcements seeming to come out of nowhere, including High Republic Acolyte, Rangers of the New Republic, Lando, Bad Batch, Droid Story, and a Rogue Squadron film. Before we can talk about how this will impact the sequel trilogy, we must first take a look at their plans for this new era and determine how it will impact that storyline and what the Filoni Verse means for the sequels. What really stands out to me is the trio of crossover releases: The Mandalorian, Rangers of the New Republic, and Ahsoka. Inside sources have been saying for years that Star Wars wants to launch its own MCU-style connected universe, confirming last year that The Mandalorian would be the launching point of the storyline, serving a similar role to Jon Favreau's Iron Man. This didn't seem incredibly far-fetched, since Star Wars is already a connected universe. What made this concept truly inspired by the MCU was the idea of having several different self-contained stories that each exist in parallel, each with its own central character, plot, and antagonist. Unbeknownst to the main characters, the actions and motives of these antagonists would be orchestrated by a larger threat, a dark conspiracy behind the curtain. The main difference between the Star Wars connected universe, already nicknamed the Filoni Verse, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe was the medium. While the MCU centered around blockbuster cinematic releases, the Star Wars CU would be told in a more drawn-out, episodic form, with Disney Plus being the primary catalyst of the story. A few weeks ago, we got our first in-universe hint of this coming from Chapter 13, The Jedi. The big and obvious introduction here was the debut of Ahsoka in live action, setting her up for her own show. Likewise, the episode was absolutely filled with hints about the character that I believe will be playing the big bad of this Star Wars connected universe, or at least Phase 1, but we will get back to that. All of this was mere speculation a few weeks ago, but that changed on Thursday when we got the heftiest Star Wars announcement in recent memory. Attached to the announcement, sources had this to say about Ahsoka and Rangers of the New Republic. The shows will cross over with future seasons of The Mandalorian and culminate in a, quote, climactic story event. While we've been speculating for a while now that this would be coming, this statement confirms that their intentions are to use these three shows to begin their own climactic story event, mimicking the style of Infinity War. Of course, what makes this climactic story event seem slightly odd is the era, as well as the presence of the Empire. The Mandalorian takes place 5 years after Endor, which is 4 years after the Battle of Jakku. By this point, Operation Cinder was already over, and everyone Palpatine considered a true Imperial would be in the unknown regions building the First Order. So the question remains, how can this storyline exist if it is going to seemingly contradict the sequels? Jakku was supposed to be the last stand of the Empire, after all. On top of that, the Battle of Jakku occurred just 1 year and 4 days after the Battle of Endor, a hefty 4 years before we meet Moff Gideon in The Mandalorian. As I mentioned earlier, I believe that Chapter 13 gave us our answer, telling us hints as to what exactly is going on. First is the decimation of Corvus under Magistrate Morgan Elsbeth, along with the reveal that her specialty was bleeding a planet's resources in order to build Imperial starships. Second is the HK assassin droids under her employ, droids bearing the logo of the 7th Fleet, as we mentioned in a previous video. Also, I found that the planet Corvus may be a reference not only to the Corvus from Battlefront 2, but also the planet Corvus Minor, which is a planet referenced in Star Wars The Final Command, the third entry in the original Thrawn trilogy. And of course, all of this comes down to the final nail in the coffin, Ahsoka's mention of Grand Admiral Thrawn by name.
Where is Grand Admiral Thrawn?
We know that rebuilding the Imperial Navy was a large plot point in the Thrawn trilogy, a trilogy that also happens to take place 5 years after the Battle of Endor, the exact same year as The Mandalorian in canon. The evidence is clear to me that Thrawn will be the ultimate major threat at the center of this climactic story event. Not only that, but the seeds are being sown for a retelling of the Heir to the Empire storyline, possibly with Ezra Bridger filling the role of Jorah Sabayoth, the crazed Jedi used by Grand Admiral Thrawn. Thrawn was AWOL for the last 4 years of the war in canon. Upon his return, he would likely be unaware of the First Order and the true goal of Operation Cinder. Thrawn believed in the Empire, but he only tolerated the Emperor, as he believed that the Empire was the only force strong enough to stand against the terrible threat that he knew was coming. In Legends, this was the Yuuzhan Vong, and in canon, they have called this threat the Grisk hegemony. If Thrawn is the main threat for Phase 1, it paves the way for the Grisk invasion to arrive in Phase 2, meaning that we may actually get the Thrawn trilogy and Yuuzhan Vong War retold in canon. One of the many things that veteran fans were disappointed by in the sequel trilogy was the fact that it ignored the two best post-Endor wars from Legends, those being the Thrawn trilogy and the Yuuzhan Vong War. With Thrawn and the Grisk storylines nearly inevitable at this point, many fans want to know how these will synergize with the sequel trilogy. For a while now, there's been a rumor floating around that this Filoni Verse will use the World Between Worlds to create a parallel timeline, one where the sequels never happened. If you don't know, the World Between Worlds was a realm of the cosmic force that connected all time and space, a la the end of Interstellar. The look of the World Between Worlds is in fact very similar to the artistic design of the Ahsoka logo. With the Ahsoka logo featuring the art style reminiscent of the World Between Worlds, it seemed to many that this would indeed be the direction they were taking. However, I can't help but feel that this is a coincidence. The whole World Between Worlds to undo the sequels thing feels a little bit too much like fan fiction or wishful thinking to me. While I have certainly been wrong before, I believe that it is much more likely that they will select another path. Rather than directly decanonize the sequels, they may instead decide to render the sequels irrelevant.
I will inflict upon the
Sequel Trilogy
the greatest insult an enemy can suffer, to be ignored.
We have to remember that, from a galactic standpoint, the sequels were hardly a blip. The First Order and the Resistance seem to function as armies that just really want to annihilate each other, and on top of that, the entire war only lasts the course of a single year. There is more time that occurs between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back than there is over the course of the entire sequel trilogy. It would be relatively easy to ignore the events of the sequels and tell stories around them. More stories that involve the New Republic and an Imperial remnant that defies Palpatine and forges its own path. That is ultimately what Thrawn always was. He believed in the Empire, and without the Emperor, he became the de facto leader and was nearly able to topple the New Republic despite being heavily outgunned and outmanned. I don't think they will decanonize the sequels, but neither do I believe that they will dwell on them too much. I believe that now it's time to get the real story, the galactic conflict we've all been waiting for. Thrawn, having returned with Ezra Bridger in tow, now seeks to return the Empire to its original glory and might. He collects the survivors of Operation Cinder from the corners of the galaxy and begins rebuilding ships and hopes to create a force strong enough to stand against the greatest threat imaginable, the arrival of the Grisk hegemony. But that is ultimately what I think the direction for Star Wars is going forward in light of the new announcements we got this week. What do you guys think? Tell me what your thoughts are down in the comments below, because as always, I want to know what you, my friends, have to say about our favorite galaxy far, far away. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, may the lore be with you, now and forever.